Has this all been informative and interesting? All right, yeah, I know this has been a great faculty. It's such a come down to listen to me. So I am going to talk a little bit about clinical trials. The only problem is there isn't a whole lot to talk about when it comes to you guys specifically. We'll talk. You've seen. The goal is to get from my slide to his slides, essentially, right? To go from the trials and the testing and stuff like that to actually being implemented. So we've now carried, Afinitor over the goal line for lung patients. We've carried now gallium over the goal line for all neuroendocrine patients, which is great. But there's still a whole lot of work to be done, and I think a lot of things that we still need to do is just recognition of lung as a kind of a special entity. So I'll talk a little bit about clinical trials just generically, and why it's important for you and me to be involved with them, and then we can talk a little bit about what trials are available. It's just there aren't that many of them essentially. Okay, so let's talk about clinical trials. So what is a clinical trial? Let's not forget, clinical trial is human research, right? So, you will hear on the nightly news, oh, science has discovered this new cure for cancer, right? And that study is always in mice, right? The problem is mice have really bad health insurance, So, the reimbursement's pretty poor. You thought Humana was bad, let me tell you now. But it's human research, that's what it is. Just kidding. For anyone who's Humana. It's okay, I still take it, don't worry. But really the purpose is to test something, right? So, when they show you those Kaplan-Meier curves in the survival, they're testing it to find out. Why? Because we used to give, ground up pork testicles to people to stimulate virility, right? And you would give it, and then someone would say, oh, look how much stronger, Mr. Jones is or whatever. And then they didn't tell you about the fact that it also causes abscesses, and he died from it, right? I mean, this is the goal. That's what the FDA was creating. So we do these very, very complicated and very expensive big pharmaceutical trials because we want to make sure that, one, that it's safe, and two, that it's something that's effective and will help people instead of just being out there as to know what's real and what's not. And that's why you can see it's so rigorous to do these studies and why it's so hard and why it's so long. I mean, in fact, we're really very fortunate that gallium was approved it was approved really in about 5 years. And that sounds like a long time, but it was actually just super quick in FDA terms. At least we have this new tool. But the goal is to test something new. So is it a new test, a new blood test? Is it a new procedure, some kind of new device or something? Is it a new medication, like we've heard about? Is it even a new protocol? Do we put one drug with another drug, or follow it with another drug, or put this drug with that, like Dr. Ober presented? Do you put pasireotide with Afinitor? Can you get some enhanced effect there? So that's what we're trying to do. And then another type of trial is just trying to gather information, right? So we talk about, oh, it's important to be aware, it's important to understand, it's important to get the word out, but at the same time, we need to understand your disease, right? So Dr. Oberg has been looking at you guys for the past 30 years, right? I've been looking at you guys for the past 6 years, and I've learned a whole heck of a lot in those 6 years just by carefully observing patients. But at the same time, if we could gather more information and learn from you all and see how your disease behaves, that's also extremely important for the generations to come of neuroendocrine, because this is only going to get worse. And then, of course, the big hot topic now is genetics, right? So one of the questions was about genetics, and we're very fortunate that in general, it's not kind of a thing you pass on to your kids, except when you do pass it on to your kids. And so that would be something really important to know. The tests we have right now, just so you know, they're little small flashlight beams that shine on little bits of your genetics. And so you can't always rely on those tests to really figure things out. I mean, I have several patients in which they've had siblings or whatever have it, and then their MEN test always comes back negative. And all that this means is that the test was inadequate for that particular person. So we need to do more. But at the same time, with all the genetic testing that we're doing now, sometimes you have information overload, and then I don't know what to do with all that information. So obviously those kinds of clinical trials that can help us understand that are extremely, extremely important, not pivotal really. Okay, so what are the goals of the clinical trial? So just understand this. And you obviously have been hinted on this already. But basically, I want to know about safety. Okay, that's extremely, extremely important, because there have been, we've read these before, there have been drugs that have been given to people, normal, healthy volunteers who have died, right, or have been put in the ICU or something awful happened to them. So we have to make sure that this is safe. And the pharmaceutical companies are well versed now in this process, and so they're very, very careful. And they work with specialized people who can do this this experiment very carefully. So Dr. Ober would be one, right? So he's doing this oncolytic virus. We have a unit upstairs from us in our Midtown office where they do all these phase 1 trials, and so they're ramping up the dose. They watch them very carefully. They're very observant about what could possibly go wrong with the drug. So safety is number 1. Number 2 is going to be safety again, right? Because the goal is to not harm you. And safety is number 3. So whenever we do these clinical trials, we've got to make sure. Even sometimes when you do clinical trials, even somewhat large clinical trials, you may do 100 or 200 patients and get your FDA approval. The companies will continue to follow the patients afterwards, right? We've seen some of these drugs come off the market because they've had post-marketing effects. So the companies, the FDA watches it carefully, the companies watch it very carefully, and over the past 5 or 10 years, the companies have been even more rigorous about following patients afterwards to see if there's any safety issues. I know for sure, even when for example, Novartis, they're here. When they have presentations about how to give the drug, they always say, if there's some problem, please call us, please call the FDA, let us know. They want to know if there are any issues happening. Okay, then the next thing you want to know is, well, what is the dose of the drug, right? So we're fortunate that maybe this oncolytic virus will work at a very low dose, but you don't know. Sometimes, traditionally the oncologists, they like to give as much as you can possibly tolerate, right? And that's not easy sometimes, but that's at least a starting point, right? So, we give, for example, the Afinitor, for example, is given at 10 milligrams, but some people can only tolerate 7.5 or 5. But they pushed it as high as they possibly could to find the right dose, and then you can tinker with it from there. So how much do you even give? Does the drug work in your disease of interest, right? So maybe, aspirin works really well for your headache, but does it really work for your diarrhea? Don't take aspirin for your diarrhea, by the way, I'm just saying. But that's the question, right? So now, sure, so I'm going to keep picking on Afinitor. So Afinitor has been used for, say, kidney cancer, right? Kidney cancer, and it's been proven to be very effective. Well, just because it works for kidney cancer doesn't mean it's going to work for pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors, so prove it to me, right? So this is where they started to prove this. And this is very important because if they can prove it, then they can go out and say, look, this has been demonstrated in big clinical trials to have efficacy, so it's important for patients to know that it works. Because for all I know eucalyptus leaves might work to cure neuroendocrine tumors. Please don't take your eucalyptus leaves. But I don't know that until someone tests it, until someone rigorously figures this out. So these are the things that are really important. In fact, the more classic example is the somatostatin analog. So the somatostatin analog, like sandostatin, which has been around helping people, many of you in the room, for a quarter of a century now, certainly as long as we've been seeing Mrs. Clinton around. And it's really nice because we have a lot of experience with it. We know it's very safe. We know it's very effective for symptoms and things like that. But even in Dr. Ober's experience, he said, well, it looks like it even has some tumor control too, right? So we say, okay, we're the experts. I learned from the experts, so I start to give it. Looks great, looks wonderful. But then, maybe your own oncologist at home doesn't quite believe it or have experience or whatever you want to call it. And so they don't do it for you at home. You have to fly all the way here to get the shot, or maybe they won't continue your shot at home, or your insurance company won't cover it. I mean, you can see how it gets more and more complicated. But then, another company called Ipsen came out with a big trial looking at specifically tumor control, and now it's been approved. And so now both the use of sandostatin and somatrogon have been used for tumor control. I mean, they're cringing over there as I say this, but that's what's happening. So does it work for your disease of interest, right? Is it better than the standard of care? There is no question that people who were taking a whole bunch of Imodium and Lomotil for their diarrhea and their carcinoid weren't really that strong. Weren't really that well. But then when they started taking octreotide and sandostatin, they got much, much, much better. So then sandostatin was approved for the treatment of diarrhea and carcinoid syndrome. So they proved that, and now it's widely used. So you can see, and this is 25 years now, we've had this wonderful drug. And then how does the medication procedure work in humans, most importantly? Because like I said before, you'll hear all these things about cell cultures, you'll hear these things about mice, you may even hear these things in, even larger dogs or monkeys or something. But they're just, a human is just a different kind of a beast. And so you have to prove that it really works in us. Okay, so what are the stages of the clinical trial? So someone has an idea, right? Either it comes from an investigator or it comes from industry. They do some preclinical trials to get a sense of whether it works, and that will be either in the petri dish or in some animal work. And then they'll send a whole bunch of documentation to the FDA. And then once they get approval, they'll get something called an IND, which is the ability to investigate this new drug. So investigation of new drug application. And then it goes through the center's institutional review board to make sure it's safe and to make sure that it's the patient is well educated. And they go through these phases. Phase 1 is a safety and a dose finding kind of thing. Phase 2 is a little bit more disease specific, and phase 3 is really a comparison for efficacy. So when you hear about that, you see like one graph that Dr. Oberg or Dr. Ramirez shows up, that is like a decade and a half and probably millions of human hours of work to get just that one picture. So it is a lot of effort and very, very expensive to make that happen. And then phase 4 is aftermarket. So if you're taking your medication, you have new side effects that they didn't see. If 1 million people start taking the drug versus 100 people, you may see something different. We certainly saw that with some of our diabetic drugs. But that's the kind of thing that happens. So now the question is, well, why should I participate? Well, why should you participate? I participate in it because I want to test new opportunities for you guys, new treatments for you. All right? But why should you participate? Well, sometimes you have no choice, right? You're really sick, you've exhausted all your standard treatments, and that's it. So then we have to put you on trial and see if that happens, if you can derive any benefit from it. So this is, in that sense, like Dr. Ramirez says, then you're not a guinea pig. Hopefully you can derive some benefit from the trial or from the drug that's being tested. But really what you're doing is you're contributing to testing of new tests and therapies, right? So I recruited 100 patients into our Gallium trial, and they, sure, they may have derived, actually a lot of them derived benefit from them because I could do better surgery on them. But some of them just did it because they wanted to know, and some of them just did it because they wanted to, help advance the technology. So that was very helpful. And in some cases, it helps us understand the disease. So there are some registry trials and some follow-up trials in which we can find out how the patients are doing over time. Because when you look at the curves, you see it's progression-free survival. So that may be, okay, well, maybe you progress 3 months, but maybe you can still live many years afterwards. Right? So there's still a lot of information that can be elicited from just being part of a clinical trial. And then, you develop these inclusion-exclusion criteria, so who qualifies and who doesn't qualify. So, for example, in the Radiant trials, they actually excluded people who had genetic components of the disease, so like MENs. Well, that would be something that maybe we should investigate. I just don't know. So it's something important there. Now, it's not perfect, right? It is a lot of work. The reason that you're so well cared for when you're in a clinical trial is because we're following you so much. But that means you've got some nurse calling you like once a week to make sure you show up to your appointment, or you write your logs, or you keep up with it. So there's a fair amount of work to do. Frequently you have to take patient logs. For example, how many times are you, in our case, how many times are you having diarrhea, for example, for a carcinoid syndrome? Maybe in your case it would be, how often do you have wheezing or something, or how often are you short of breath or something? So there's something there. It's pretty frequent visits. I think most of you like to see me maybe once or twice a year, but not more than that, despite the fact that I think I'm charming, but I don't know if that's really true. But if you're part of a clinical trial, you'll have to see your doc probably every 2 weeks or a month, or in some cases even every week. So there's definitely more intense investigation involved. And sometimes it involves an invasive procedure as well. So you may have to have a biopsy, or you may have to have more scans, or you may have to have something else. So there's definitely work involved for all of us. But that's really the reason why we need your help, is because we need to learn more. So some of the resources you can take a look at, there's actually a pretty good one. The North American Neuroendocrine Tumor Society, nanets.net, has a pretty good site that stays up with a lot of the clinical trials. And of course, you can always go to clinicaltrials.gov. It's the federal government's log and a catalog of all the clinical trials going on. If you do a clinical trial, by law, you are required to register at clinicaltrials.gov. So even when I did my Gallium trial, I had to go on there and register so people could read it. And that's just really important. One thing you should know, though, not all of those trials are American. So a lot of those may be in Europe, like the one that Dr. Oberg showed you. So you may not have access to it locally, but just be aware. Okay, so that's kind of what clinical trials are. That's kind of, my feeling as to why we should all participate in them. And here's clinicaltrials.gov. So you can see here, it gives you a pretty good catalog of the various trials that are available, and it tells you if it's already completed. So sometimes it can be a little bit disappointing because it looks like you may get 200 results, but 197 of them may be completed already, so it may not be available. But it's still a great access. So the one definite trial that you have dedicated to you guys is this SPIMET trial. This is the use of lanreotide, which is a somatostatin analog like sandostatin. It's called somatuline. And specifically, they're looking at lung neuroendocrine. So the trial is this somatuline autogel or depot. It's 120 milligrams, which is the registered standard dose in digestive neuroendocrine tumors versus placebo in patients who have specifically lung neuroendocrine tumors, looking for efficacy and safety. It's mostly efficacy. I think everyone's pretty safe with it. And it's a good trial because it's dedicated to lung, much as Radiant-4 was kind of dedicated to lung and non-functional GI carcinoids. Really, the information we got was for lung. That's great. And this one is really just for you guys. And so the inclusion criteria is you have to have metastatic or unresectable disease because, right, the first therapy should always be what? The first therapy for neuroendocrine should always be surgery, right? And the second therapy should always be right. And the third therapy should always be excellent. What a teachable group. I love this. So we always want to get it out whenever you can, right? And so they're looking at typical or atypical neuroendocrine tumors of the lung. So nothing too angry. Obviously, you need to have a histologic diagnosis, so you have to have a biopsy-proven diagnosis. You can't just have symptoms. You want to have the mitotic index, so we learned from Dr. Ryan of a relatively well-behaved, either less than 2 or less than 10 for your tumors. You have to have some measurable disease, because if you have no measurable disease, they can't tell if it's working or not. And then in this part of this trial, they want you to have a somatostatin receptor positive imaging. So that means you either have to have a positive octreotide scan or a positive gallium scan. Their rationale is, well, look, we have a hormone that treats the receptor, so you should have the receptor to make it hopefully more effective. Unfortunately, sometimes in neuroendocrine tumors of the lung specifically, the octreotide scan is either too weak and doesn't catch it, or a lot of neuroendocrine tumors of the lung don't have somatostatin receptor. In fact, I've tried to enroll a couple of people, and their octreotide scans were negative, so I couldn't get them in. So that's just one of the criteria. And then, of course, the exclusion criteria is what you would expect. Anyone who has a high-grade tumor, because the drug is probably just too weak for high-grade tumors. Anyone who's been treated recently with a somatostatin analog, so it wouldn't make any sense if you were doing fine on Sando to switch you over to somatuline. You're doing okay. If anyone who's had PRRT, right, and you don't want to have PRRT because that's a long-term therapy. So why would you go on to this trial when you're actually doing pretty great? And then how would you figure it out? Is it the experimental therapy or is it the PRRT? And of course, anyone who's been treated with basically a whole bunch of different hard chemotherapies that have really hurt them recently, because then you can't make that a difference. So I'm really excited by it. This trial is open across the country. We have it open in Denver. It's open down in New Orleans, and we're very fortunate. I'm part of something called the U.S. Oncology Network. So I can actually open this trial in about 2 weeks all across the country at any of our sites. So they've been very, very supportive of it. So they just opened just a couple months ago, so they're still looking for patients to get on it. So if you think you might qualify, let your doc know or let me know. Okay, so after that, then the list becomes pretty short, and as you can see, the font becomes pretty small. And that was really only because I had to get all these words in here. So the first trial that's still kind of ongoing, I guess you can't really be a part of it, is only if it's like the extension trial of Radiant-4. So if you were on the Radiant-4 trial and you had some benefit, or you rolled over, or they are following for long term, you can do that, but you can't start it. You can't start it new. There's some things called basket trials as well too. So for example, if you have specific genetic mutations, they'll take you whatever tumor type you have. So for example, if you have something called like a NTRK, ROS, or ALK gene, then you can be eligible for that. They don't care if you're neuroendocrine. They just want to know about your mutation. So that's called a basket trial. And then there's some other drugs out, and this is for all neuroendocrine. This is not just for you, right? You can see there's YF476 for specifically for stomach neuroendocrine tumors. There's a trial that's open now. Actually, it's open at our place. It's called looking at a drug called cabozantinib, looking specifically at neuroendocrine tumors, the pancreas, and other carcinoid tumors. So that actually would work for you all. There's a drug that's being tested down in Houston called LEE-011, specifically looking at neuroendocrine tumors of the foregut. So you guys qualify for that too. Combination of targeted radiotherapy, so that's essentially PRRT for neuroendocrine tumors. That's at the University of Iowa. Dr. Strasberg and Moffitt has a trial looking at ibrutinib in carcinoids and neuroendocrine tumors. I think that might be digestible, I'm not sure. And then Dr. Reedy and Dr. Weber in New York at Memorial Sloan Kettering, they have a next generation of PRRT, which is actually really very interesting. It's called JR11. So they're doing imaging as well as lutetium therapeutics to see if they can help people with neuroendocrine tumors. I don't think there's a cutoff for lung or anything like that. So as long as your diagnostic test is positive, then you would qualify for the therapy. And that just opened a few months ago, so I think they're just kind of getting going. And then there's another drug called nintedanib, which is being used for neuroendocrine tumors. And then also this kind of extension study for lanreotide called Clarinet Forte. So those are the ones that are available in the United States. There are other trials that I looked up too, which were available in Europe, but they're just harder to get to. Other than PRRT, I think those were very, very similar to the kind of things we do. Maybe some combinations and stuff like that. So there are more trials that kind of go on, which I think kind of reached, which are getting either in development or not quite kind of widespread or highly recruiting. But you can see here there's a drug called SNX5422 plus everolimus. Is that a Novartis drug? Is that yours? No, I'm not sure. Anyway, with everolimus for neuroendocrine tumors, the group at Iowa is looking at Y90, so yttrium-90 PRRT in combination with their gallium. I think it's a relatively small trial. It's mostly for children, so I don't think it's really for most of us. There is a trial looking at capecitabine temozolomide plus bevacizumab, so Dr. Oberg's combination for pancreas. There's a trial which has been pretty slow, unfortunately, looking specifically at everolimus in pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors and people who've been resected in their liver, so who've been debulked in the liver to see how fast they recur and see if it helps. It's been a little bit slow to come on. You can see there are a bunch of actually new drugs which are kind of being investigated. So there's these things called VEGF inhibitors and platelet-derived growth factor dual kinases, so they can be fancier and fancier. It's a little bit like having a VCR and a DVD player in one with everolimus for treating these tumors. So that's actually very encouraging. There is a trial looking at another drug called pazopanib, which is also something called a tyrosine kinase inhibitor plus temozolomide. So you can slowly start to see some of these things that are newer agents that are coming along. Most of them I can't even pronounce, and I read this slide a couple of times. But you can see that there are a couple things that are available, and the whole idea. Oh, one actually I should mention it because it's open in New Orleans, is the compassionate use of radioactive MIBG. So we've been talking about SSTR and the somatostatin receptor a lot for Sando and for somatulene and for PRRT. But we forget sometimes these neuroendocrine tumors, they have a specific pathway that process this molecule called MIBG. And MIBG comes as a scan, which is normally used for pheochromocytomas, which is a tumor that usually causes hypertension and usually comes from the adrenal glands. But sometimes neuroendocrine tumors take up this MIBG. So if you give enough of it as a radioactive form, you can actually make it a therapeutic. So a lot like PRRT, there's this radioactive MIBG. And Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Waltering have been doing this for several years now and have seen some good results. It's not widespread, and it's not nearly going to be as widespread as our PRT will be, but it's something that's certainly available and effective in certain neuroendocrine tumors. So just some of the trials that are available for testing and imaging, which is still probably a little less exciting, but are going on, and we learn a lot from it. There's the Register Net, so anyone who may have had the REN test or the NET test. It's a blood test looking at DNA and RNA inside the blood to help us understand neuroendocrine tumors. They're doing a big test on that. In Canada, they're doing the NetSeq program, which is they're profiling net neuroendocrine tumors and trying to understand them from a molecular perspective. People are looking at MIBG, like I mentioned to you. I just put this up here. This trial is closed, but that's my trial there, that clinical trials one, the 68 dotatate PET scan. That's finished now, thankfully. It was a pain in the derriere to do by myself, but it was great. Had some great collaborators. But then people are collecting blood. People are looking at novel therapies. People are looking at molecular analyses. People are comparing different types of PET scans. At the NIH, there's a natural history, which actually I think some of you are enrolled in. People are looking at different types of gallium scanning, and people are even looking to see if mutational therapies can help predict which is the best therapy, say Afinitor versus Sutent for the treatment of neuroendocrine tumors. Tends to be mostly for the gut, but certainly might be available to you all. So you can see there's quite a lot of interest. I mean, certainly compared to when Dr. Oberg started practicing, he told me the story that he first saw his first neuroendocrine case in 1977. Yeah, so back then the word neuroendocrine didn't even exist, really, right? And so we've come a long, long ways. And actually, I'm very, very encouraged personally, because since I've joined the group here in Denver, I've realized that you don't necessarily have to work at a university to do really interesting research. I went down to Phoenix to visit a group that works with the U.S. Oncology Network called TGen. And they're a company that's really interested in translational work, so translational genetics, for genomics was what it was. But when I got down there and I met with this very famous medical oncologist, his name is Dr. Dan Van Hoff, and I said, I specialize in neuroendocrine. He says, oh, I think neuroendocrine is so interesting. We see 7 molecules a week, and I think a lot of them might work for neuroendocrine. So we're going to hopefully start collaborating where I can send them tissue and we can develop new protocols, and hopefully we can get some of these new molecules out towards you, because it doesn't help if they sit on someone's shelf. It doesn't help if it's being injected into a mouse. It only helps if we get it out there, test it rigorously, really determine if it's effective, and get it out to you all. Because only then is it anything worthwhile. Because I know for sure that Dr. Oberg, I've read a lot of papers on Dr. Oberg's work with the virus for like the past 10 years. But for the past 10 years, it's only helped mice. So now hopefully very soon we'll be able to help you all. So just one more time, if you want to take a look, the nanets.net is a pretty good website for clinical trials. And of course, take a look at clinicaltrials.gov. And that's pretty much it, I think. Yeah, that's all I have. All right, good. So sorry, that's